Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's Q&A. I'm doing one more mic experiment that turned out to be a complete failure. So there'll be an explanation at the end. I know a lot of people don't really care, so I'm not going to waste any more time on this. But there are a lot of other content creators that watch these, and just a lot of my fellow nerd friends that enjoy kind of the tech side of things. So I'll explain the fail at the end, but let's jump right into the Q&As. First up, two questions from Brento, both about input lag. So the first question is, do you know of a way I can measure how much input lag I'm getting with MAME on my RetroPie? So there's a few ways to do it. The way that I personally would do it is have a controller with an LED light in it and a very fast camera. I use a Sony that runs at 960 frames per second and an original arcade board. And that's unfortunately the kicker with this one. So, for example, once I get more of the newer Raspberry Pi solutions in, I want to start doing this just for a fun video. But I'll be taking Mortal Kombat 1 and then pressing punch on, make sure it's the same character. So I'll probably pick Scorpion because that's who I always play as. Pick punch and then shoot that in 960 frames per second and count how many frames, because 960 FPS is essentially 1 millisecond per frame. It's a little off, but close enough so that this demonstration would be accurate. And then I would put it in Premiere and fast forward frame by frame, and then count how many frames to the time the light turns on as the time till the time there's actually a punch thrown. I try to get it so movement on the screen, and you just have to kind of watch it a few times to see, and that way like if his fist starts to move, that's when the punch is thrown. So that's what I count it as, and I'll do that 20 times, which takes a long time with a slow motion camera, and then I'll hook up the emulation solution with the same controller and do the same test. Now there's things like USB controllers that could get in the way, but it is a realistic test in the fact of that's the real experience. You're using the controller you would have normally. So that's how I would do it, and then I would count the difference between the two in milliseconds and make sure I do it definitely like 10 times at the minimum, just because you never know. Sometimes certain software isn't always consistently accurate with stuff like that. And that's how you can get a basic idea of things like that. And I just did this with a Neo Geo machine because something that you may have seen in the background before, it's an upcoming video for next month where I took an old Neo Geo machine, an emulation machine, and rebuilt it with real hardware. And in that, it had a very total piece of crap emulator, and I found that just the emulation lag was something like 4 frames of lag. So that's at least how I would do it. There's a few other ways you could do it using an oscilloscope, but it may or may not work depending on your situation. So that's certainly the way I do it. And as long as you do it like 20 times each, 20 times on original and on emulation, you should get a good average. And it's not going to be to the millisecond perfect, but I would think that it's close enough for the test that we all do. The next question is, you use the time sleuth on one of your monitors, and you get different results on each of the 3 squares, and that's exactly correct. It's because of the way the signal is drawn from top to bottom. On a CRT, for example, the top left corner would show almost 0 milliseconds on the time sleuth. It would be like 0 point something something. The middle would be about 8 milliseconds, and then the bottom right corner would be 16.5 milliseconds. So that's kind of the same. Although a flat screen draws its image differently, it's about the same for lag, in the fact that it's going to be slower up top than it is on the bottom. Faster on top, smaller number than it is on the bottom. Sorry. So what I would do is measure all 3 and just compare them in your head up against what a CRT would be like. So for me, the top 2 numbers are the ones that I always pay attention to. That way you could tell how fast the display lights up at, versus, sends the signal and lights up, and then an average in the middle. So, it's actually very common now to find displays, modern displays, 2018 and after, that are a frame 16 milliseconds or lower total. So that's actually pretty cool. But that's pretty much how you would test it. There's some other factors involved, but for your average gaming, that's how I would do it. Because everything else, it's going to be a noticeable enough difference. I could go into a long, deep explanation that's still going to come down to, if it's under a frame of lag, you should be happy enough. And I believe your final question was, some HDMI ports seem to be slightly faster or slower. And I've seen that before as well, and some places even tell you use this HDMI port for gaming, and it's just a matter of the processors that it goes through. Because every single flat screen TV has essentially an upscaler in it, usually a garbage cheap one, but it's going to have some kind of scaling because all of the panels have to get their native resolution, or else they don't quite look right. Once again, I'm very much oversimplifying here, but uh, that's basically why sometimes you would see it differently, because some ports might be routed slightly differently through the scaler. It might go through some kind of auto switch that takes 2 milliseconds for your TV to read. But all of that stuff's pretty common, and I just wouldn't obsess over the milliseconds. I would just try to, obviously try to get the lowest possible. But as long as it's something where your TV is under a frame of lag, you should just be happy with that result, and anything else is kind of like a cool bonus. Once again, this is 5 minutes of me oversimplifying everything I've explained, so it didn't turn into a 40-minute explanation. So if you need clarification on anything, or if there's any of my OCD friends listening that my explanations drove them crazy, please post and I will correct myself or reread next week. Ben Abresh had a question about Wii component cables. He said he has a set of monster cables and generally buys everything from HD Retrovision, but was curious if the monster cables were already similar in quality or would it be worth the upgrade. That's a really good question. And because I got to know Nick and Steve so well, and because I see how Steve gets when he makes these cables and like how much of a perfectionist he is, uh, you know, in real life performance, they're probably going to be the same, but I'm sure if you really dug into it, you'd find the HD Retrovisions were technically better in some or a few different ways. So I guess to answer your question directly, what I would say is if the Wii is your favorite console, or if it's one that you use all the time, yeah, upgrade to the HD Retrovisions just for that tiny little chance that you might see something else. But if, like myself, I don't really use the Wii that much, for me, if I already owned the monster cables, I probably wouldn't go out and buy the HD Retrovisions just because. So it's kind of it's kind of a good way to look at it. But if you don't have the original Wii or a good set like the monster cables, if you had just said I got a $10 set off Amazon that seems to be fine, my advice would be the opposite. I would say absolutely get the HD Retrovisions and just keep the others as spares, or cut the ends or off and use them to wire your own thing or whatever else. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If HD Retrovision stuff is always going to be a little bit a step above, just because of the stringent testing it goes through. It's just a matter of would you see the difference or not, and maybe or maybe not with Monster. Probably not. John, the owner of Tasty Chicken, had one of the most important and thoughtful questions ever asked in these Q&As. If the Retro Roundtable had a fight to the death, who would win? You would each get one weapon. I get to bring my D32 or OLED. Voltar gets his Kesker Station or blow-up doll. Nick and Steve get their Dreamcast cables. Wait, no. HDMIzer. Wait, no. Wii cables. And Renee would be too overpowered if we let him bring his moose or bear, so he's stuck with either his maple syrup or a hockey stick. Who would be the last one standing? Well, that's a good question. I think Steve is probably out of the best shape of all of us, with Renee coming in second. Nick thinks that he's in shape, but he's got a giant beard, so that's going to slow him down in all of this. I'm clearly the most out of shape, but I'm probably also the biggest. So I don't know. I think that would be a great one to find out, and I think maybe one of these days we should have like a tag team live wrestling match where we all put on those big wrestling suits. And I think we should do this for real. I don't think any of us would actually want to bring our OLED TVs or soldering stations to fight with, but I never thought of this, and now I love this idea. So I will talk to the gentleman, and I will see if someday maybe we could put together a giant wrestling ring. We would obviously, clearly have to have Yahel from Wrestling with Gaming be there in some way. Maybe he's the ref or the announcer or all of the above. But I would absolutely love to do just a brutal, hardcore wrestling match with those big padded things on. So even if you punch each other full speed, or, full strength, it's not really going to hurt. I would love to do that. And I think in that scenario, I might wreck everybody. So here we go, talking to you, Retro Roundtable. If we do this, let's do it with the big suits on and make it happen. I would love to have that happen. Question from Dan Mons. By the way, welcome, Dan. Glad to see you here. Also, kind of funny that I'm getting a question from somebody that I normally ask questions to. But great question. Is there any decent line havers or downscalers out there available now? There was ones out there before. There's still some of the remaining ones like the Extron devices. But the thought is being able to take VGA capable devices, so anything you could get into 480p VGA. So Xbox 360 does that with just a cable. You could do that in a PS3 with some kind of basic converter. But to be honest with you, no, there's nothing new out there. The newest solution was when people figured out those Koryo TV1 boxes can be programmed specifically to do just that. I vaguely remember testing this with Carsey because I went over there to try to work on the same type of experiment with him, and we found that the Extron devices, the Super Emoshas, had 1 frame of lag and performed very well. Overall, I mean, it's still 1 frame of lag is probably less than you're going to get from a flat screen. So playing an Xbox 360 game on a tube monitor with 1 frame of lag added by the downscaler, fair enough. And I think the Koryo ones had slightly more, might have been as much as 2 frames of lag, but I couldn't really get mine working that well, and then I ended up giving mine away. So I think the best place to check would be the guide that Doherty, I think I'm saying that right, posted on the Shmups forum that shows how you reprogram your TV1, Koryo TV1, and try that one for yourself. I believe you could still find them for under $100 on eBay, so it's not the worst. It's not like tracking down a Super Emosha, which at least is $200 now. But I think that would be the best bet for today. And the other question you asked is, do I know anybody making them? I've bugged Marcus about this a few times to see if he would do like the reverse of an OSSC, and he said he thought it would be possible, but it's not really on his list of things to do yet. There's been a few people that talked about it, but to be honest, I think more people would need one of these, and I think more people would need to know something like this even exists. So maybe that's up to me. Maybe it's I've been talking about doing it and just have no extra time, but maybe I really should spend the time to show people exactly what these devices are and why you would want to use one. And it would be really cool if we could figure out a way to do this in real time so that it's less than a frame of lag. So OSSC is like pretty much 0 lag, nothing that you could even really test. So something like that, like an opposite of the OSSC. No one's put one out yet, but I really have a strong feeling like that if somebody did, they would be able to sell enough to at least justify the time and the cost. And maybe not right away. Maybe it's one of those things like the Game Boy Advance Consolizer, where I do a video on it and get us nerds in the know all hyped up. Then something comes out, and then somebody like My Life in Gaming and others do a follow-up video showing people how to now use the device. It's probably the best course of action. So I'll get on it, but for now, your only options are tracking down an expensive Super Emosha, which will work great, or it'll work great just by plugging it in, or trying to find a Koryo TV1 and reprogramming it and setting it up that way, which will be a lot cheaper, but it's a lot more complicated to deal with. You probably won't have any issues with it, but it's much more complicated than just plugging something in and flipping some switches. And obviously you might have mixed results because I followed the instructions to a T and mine had issues. So I had to reflash the firmware. Maybe I had a bad cable or something. That's always plausible. So definitely check those out. Okay, laptop is now plugged in. That'll make sense to anybody sticking around later on for the tech discussion. But the next question is from Patrick Fitzgerald. And he wants to know if he takes his analog FPGA consoles and his Xbox One S and uses an HDMI switch, would he have to worry about lag? And if there's a particular model that's recommended? So that's a great question. I don't know if I'd call it a noob question or not, but it's definitely a good one. First and foremost, you would always really want to double check something like that, especially if you were going to start to spend some serious cash to upgrade. That's why I always recommend people pick up like the Time Sleuth, upside down, the Time Sleuth just to try. And it's so funny because so many people, when I first talked about it, said things like, why would I spend $100 on a device I'm only going to use once? And a lot of those people messaged me later on like, I'm sorry, I actually use this on all my friends' TVs, my family. It's cool to learn about stuff like this. So definitely, if you don't have one, at least consider buying a time sleuth. But to answer your question, anything that processes the signal is going to add some kind of lag. So you could you could find yourself HDMI switches that'll add like 2 milliseconds. Not enough to worry about. Totally cool. Same thing with AVRs, like a Denon stereo with different HDMI inputs. Some of them will add a bunch of lag, and others will only add a millisecond or two, nothing to worry about. So the first thing to do is I would just check. Dave Dirkswissler has a post on the Shmups forum about the HDMI equipment he's been using that definitely hasn't added any significant lag to him at all. And I think in that same thread, people might have even mentioned stuff that did add lag. Stuff like that SCART to HDMI converter, the one that I hate so much that I'm still about to do a video on, that has an HDMI pass-through, and that pass-through adds 2 frames of lag. So I would just look for switches or AVRs that people had used and kind of already given the okay to, especially if you ever try to use something like the OSSC or the GC Video HDMI solutions. There could be some kind of compatibility issues. So I would just double check for that and for lag. And if you really wanted to know for sure, grab a time sleuth and test yourself. And it is just as easy as plug the time sleuth into the switch into your TV, and then do the test as if it were plugged in directly. Just do one directly into the TV and then one through the switch, and then you'll have your differences. So yeah, hopefully that points you in the right direction. But that is a good question, and one that I wish there was a bit more information out there on. Okay, now mic swap. Next question. Pablo Romero said that he's kind of lost track of the GameCube Wii scene and wants to know if there's anything coming up in the near future for those consoles. As far as I know, the only thing coming out soon is the component video cable from Insurrection Industries. And that was delayed, 7 months now, I guess, because they really, really wanted to get it as good as possible. And I think the circuit board has been done and tested and working well for 7 months now. I think they really just wanted the cable side, the strain relief, and everything else to be as good as possible. And they were taking that very, very seriously. So I think they strongly would lean towards the side of they'd rather piss people off with delays than let people down on a product that wasn't as good as they hoped. So as far as I know, that's the only thing somewhat new coming out for the GameCube. Everything else has been out there, for a while now and tried and tested, whether you like it or not. I'm sure there's eventually going to be more versions of the GC Video firmware. So I guess that kind of takes care of your question, and that might actually be better for you because you said you prefer 480p analog scaled on the OSSC than 480p digital to digital. So Insurrection's component cables might just be the best solution for you because that'll go directly into the OSSC. Bo Lee said that he had just picked up a PC Engine Duo R modded with Tim Worthington's AV driver, and he needs to get new SCART cables for it, and wants to know if both the Retro Gaming UK and Retro Access are the best choice. So yes, and Insurrection's cables that I've tested have been good as well. And I just want to give a little bit more explanation to that. A lot of people out there can make good quality cables, something that you'd be very happy to use and that work great. The problem isn't being able to make good cables. It's the problem is to be able to consistently make large runs of good cables. So that's kind of why I'm always talking about those two, as well as Insurrection for the ones that they supply as well. Just because you're not going to find some of these handmade eBay sellers that have great cables, you're not going to get them in consistency, and it's just impossible. There's no way that you could, unless you've set up a business to do it. There's no way that you can get the quality that these companies hit. So yes, those would definitely be my recommendation. And depending how the Duo R was modded, it's probably going to have an 8-pin DIN, not mini DIN. So whichever, I think Retro Access sells cables directly designed to be used with that. So maybe that would be your first place to look, just because I'm pretty sure they've made cables with this exact scenario in mind. But check both, because maybe you're in the UK and it's faster just to go there. Conrad Klaus asked for any recommendations I had for a power supply for the PS1. That's the small white console. Maybe people call it the PS Slim. And unfortunately, I don't have any recommendations. Is it the same power barrel connector as the PS2 Slim? If it is, that's universally known as a really great power supply, so you might want to just double check that first. But if not, if anybody else has any suggestions, please post down below. Maybe Firebrand X, if he's listening. I don't know if those Triad power supplies come in a model with a barrel that fits the original PS1. I certainly have had good luck with those, but my first suggestion would be double check and see if the PS2 Slim PSU works. And if not, hopefully somebody listening will be able to help out. Next is a question from N. He has a G-SCART switch plugged into a PVM, and he's having trouble figuring out how to connect the Gamecube easily. He's got an NTSC model and the official component cables. Before he got the G-SCART switch, he would just change out the cables, but that's becoming a pain. Agreed. So now that the Garo no longer includes a SCART connector, do you have any recommendations? So that's actually not true. Here's a brand new Garo right here, one of the newer models, and it's got a SCART output right here. So component in, and you could do either VGA or SCART output. The only question is, do you want to spend money on a device that changes the signal? And there's a few factors in this. So first of all, I guess when it comes to analog out, the official GameCube component cables are still the best by a hair. If Extrems is listening, he's probably going, more than a hair, but so if you want to continue to use those, I understand. The way the Garo works sometimes has issues and sometimes doesn't, which leads me to be worried in that, is it going to change the signal enough for you to notice? So I guess there's a few options. First and foremost, you can get your GameCube modded to have analog RGB output. So that's either an internal mod, you can get the Eon Mark II. I'm not sure if there's any other solutions coming out that are plug-and-play RGB only. I think that would be pretty awesome if maybe Insurrection's next product was a SCART cable version of it. But point being, you can get direct RGB from your GameCube without the need for another device. And the Eons is like 150, and you might be able to get an internal one done for less. I think these are like $80 now. Correct me if I'm wrong on this one. So, quite about half the price, I guess. So I guess it would really come down to your use case scenarios and if there was any other devices in the mix. So, for example, if you had a bunch of component video devices, I would consider getting something like the G-Comp switch, and then either running that directly into your PVM. If you have two inputs, that'll work. If not, maybe you can get a different kind of switch for that, or through the Garo into the G-SCART, so now you have everything plugged in together. All the stuff in the G-Comp goes to the Garo, goes to the G-SCART, goes to the monitor, and everything's automated. That would work. If you know of a scenario, if there's going to be lots of different times you might want to put component video to either VGA or SCART, then the Garo makes sense because you could use it for more than one thing. But if you're really just talking about getting the signal from the GameCube through your G-SCART into a PVM, getting if it's a 480i only PVM, you might get away with just getting a really good shielded Super Nintendo SCART cable and a PAL GameCube with a Xeno GC installed, and that might actually be about $100 for all that if you could track one down pretty easily. Especially depends on where you live. And then you could have a GameCube with an official RGB out solution and not really have to worry about anything. So it's a very tough question to answer, only because there are so many different ways to go about doing it. So I'm sorry this is a little rambly. If you could give any more details to your setup, I'd be able to give you a more specific recommendation to what you would need. It's just, if it were me personally, I would get the plug-and-play solution and then get a SCART cable and use the G-SCART switch that way, because the only time I use my GameCube is to use the Game Boy interface software for RGB output of Game Boy games. So for me personally, that's my choice because that fits my needs best. But there's so many other factors involved. Give me a little bit more info and I'll be able to elaborate next week and maybe might be able to get you a good solution. A few questions from ElmerM. First, it was cool catching up at Too Many Games. Yeah, absolutely awesome meeting you in person. In fact, I met a bunch of people there. It's always so cool to meet people in person and chat for a bit. So great meeting you. The questions: do all systems eventually need a recap? Or are there systems that could live without it? And which systems definitely need to be recapped? So the first part of your question is a much more general answer, in that anything with a capacitor in it is eventually going to need those capacitors replaced, or it's just not going to work. Now, all surface mount capacitors are different. I'm just talking about any of the cans that usually leak out. Any of that stuff is going to eventually need it. I usually forget an example when people ask me this question, but as far as which systems need to be recapped, definitely the Game Gear, definitely any of the Duo consoles. And at this point, I kind of take them all apart. It's less common on like Super Nintendo or Genesis, but I've seen a Nintendo console where I didn't think the caps needed replacing at all. I did it anyway, and then I popped open the can with the RF in it, and that also has the power board and everything else, and all of the caps had leaked out, and it was all gross. So it's one of those things where you should, if you're concerned about it for your electronics, you should definitely check. Everything's going to need it at some point, and it's very tedious and boring to do that. I like to do it on days where I could just kind of get into a groove and do two things and just spend like all afternoon spacing out, almost like meditating while recapping or something. But as far as I know, please correct me, everybody listening, because I always seem to forget. But Game Gear in the Duos, Turbo Duo or PC Engine Duo, are always the number one things for me. Oh, and Turbo Express. Those as well. I've had a few of those straight up smell like rotten fish before. I've seen that. It's actually kind of common because when the capacitors leak, it smells, and you really got to scrub to get that funk off of the board. So I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to like look around. Any of my other devices around here that need it, but I think those four: PC Engine Duo, Turbo Duo, the Game Gear, and the Turbo Express. I think those should, even if you had one sealed and brand new from the 90s, open it up and take the caps out because they probably already leaked all over the motherboard. So I think that's a good start. And the last question, do you think there will be a no-cut mod for the Dreamcast HDMI? Definitely not anytime in the future. I had bugged Christoph and Dan about that, and it is the way it is for a million different reasons. If it does come out, I certainly wouldn't not buy it now in hopes that it's going to come out later. That's, I hope that puts it into perspective. If it does come out, it's not going to be within a reasonable time period to wait. So, hope I hit all the questions. Fabio Leporelli asked, is the Game Boy Advance consoleizer worth it if you already have a GameCube, Game Boy player running Game Boy Advance through an OSSC? He has no complaints about his current setup other than the space factor, and that some of the scanline options in the consoleizer look great. So you just hit everything right on the nose. You explained for me what I would have normally answered in a question like this. First and foremost, if you already have this and you have no complaints, then you have a great setup. And I would not say that any one is better than the other if you already have it set up. If you have nothing and you only care about Game Boy and not GameCube games, as kind of like I do, because I play GameCube on Wii, then I would say get the Game Boy Advance consoleizer just because it's easier overall. Even if you're not great at soldering, so you spend a day taking your time and doing it, and now you're just done and you have a device, just one little thing. And the scan lines are pretty freaking awesome on that. I agree with you there. But other than that, as far as performance and everything else goes, Extrems did an amazing job. I think I gush over that software enough for people to know I'm serious about it. So if you don't have any complaints other than scan lines, I would just leave well enough alone. Maybe someday there'll be more features on one or the other that would drive people to make their choice, but it's an excellent solution, and it's exactly what I use for RGB, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. Before I wrap up the Q&As, I just want to let everybody know that I have officially linked the Discord channel with Patreon. So anybody who subscribes from any platform can be part of the Discord. I manually leave the link there. And when I first saw the option for this, I didn't link it directly with Patreon because I've had very bad luck in the past with linking accounts. So, one takes control of the other, auto posts, blah, blah, blah. So I just opened it up and posted manually about it. But now I realized everything's running smooth, everything's cool. So now I just re-linked it. So it's the same exact Discord channel as there always was for the past few months. Nothing's different about that. It's just now officially linked directly in with Patreon. So if you got a message about that, or if you saw that, it's nothing new. It's just now I felt more comfortable linking the two accounts. Other than that, if you're new to the Q&As, ask any question you would like at all, including who would win in a retro roundtable fight, whatever you got. Just please post the question in the newest Q&A wherever it is that you subscribe. So YouTube, Subscribestar, Bitbacker, Patreon, whatever. Just find the latest Q&A and post your question there, because the way these things work, I can't really filter questions from older Q&As. And if I somehow miss yours, please just re-ask it. Sometimes it's just a timing thing, and it's usually just a complete accident. So, well, as always, thanks to everybody for participating. And now on to the nerd computer discussion, if anybody's interested. I imagine most people will probably turn it off right now. That's totally cool. But computer nerds, here we go. Okay, now on to the tech stuff. First, the big fail and the explanation. The good news is I finally found a laptop with a graphics card that works for me. I have a desktop that's perfect for all 1080p stuff. It's 8 years old, so I don't want to push it and upgrade it to 4K. I think it's time to just save my money and be able to get a 4K ready desktop, let's just say. But last year I did end up buying a new laptop, and it was the biggest bonehead mistake I have made in a long time. I forgot to check the exact model of the video card that was built in, and you can't really use that for Premiere. So not only did I spend a lot of money on a laptop that I love that's fast, but it's useless for all the video editing that I do. So I think I found one. It's one of the Asus Republica Gamer laptops. It's got an RTX 2070 graphics card, and the overall speed is about the same as my desktop and my laptop, but the graphics card has been working better. I tested stuff like just basic 4K 60 footage from that GH5 camera that I saved up to finally be able to buy. And as a comparison, that video footage won't play at all in Premiere on the laptop. Like nothing, it just kind of freezes up. On my desktop, even at 1/8 preview quality, it's still super, super choppy. And now on this laptop at 1/4 quality, it plays fine. So I think mission accomplished from that side on the laptop. I think it's cheap enough where I'm not going to hate myself for buying it. I could sell the other laptop and pay for a large chunk of this one. The graphics card's good enough for editing. And the other thing I really wanted to see in this podcast, or in this Q&A, is can I use it to shoot video reliably? Because the other laptop wasn't reliable enough, because anytime it got GPU heavy, something would happen. So it seems like yes, and it seems like yes even in battery powered mode, which is why I made that comment before, which is important if I'm going to be on the road. Sometimes you just got to do stuff without power plugged in. So I think the laptop was all a giant win, except the lav mic was plugged into its built-in microphone input, which stinks. And that moves us on to the other tech part I wanted to discuss, is the microphones again. So part one of that is obviously I screwed up by recording this whole thing only listening to my desktop speakers, which I obviously had plugged into the laptop, and not my studio headphones, because afterwards I realized that the entire lav mic section that I recorded is garbage because of the built-in sound card in this laptop. So lesson to everybody, feel free and point and laugh at me for making the mistake, but whenever you're doing any kind of audio into a laptop, get a good USB audio interface, even if it's just a basic cheap one for microphone recording. I think I had one for $8 I used for a while that at the very least was better than the one that was built in. That's a minimum. So sorry, that first half of the thing was a total fail. I'm going to do one more comparison on this upcoming weekly podcast, because there was one major mistake I made last week. In the comparison, I had my lav mic, and then I had this desktop microphone, but I was standing back probably like this far, maybe a little farther away, which means that afterwards I had to spike the volume, and it was still way too low for most people. And when you raise the volume of something like that, you're also raising the background noise, completely defeating the purpose. So a few people in the comments, thank you if any of you were one of them, reminded me that with a microphone like this one that I have switched to, I need to stand very close to the microphone, both for the overall reasons that you would expect. So that's what I did this time. I guess the final experiment will be on next week's podcast with the same audio interface that I've been using originally for both, just standing close to this mic. And if not, hopefully, if it doesn't work out, hopefully I could return this one. Just for the record, though, I went to B&H, which is a giant electronics store in New York City, and I went to their microphone testing booth, which was very purposely in the middle of the floor and not in a soundproofed room for these exact scenarios. I tried, I think the cheapest microphone was $50, and the most expensive microphone was $1,500 almost. And this one, the one that I settled on, the Rode Procaster, I think it's called, this overall picked up the least amount of background noise, significantly less than like the Blue Yeti, than the lav mic, than everything else. So I thought it was at least worth trying, and that's why, although some people get annoyed, that's why I'm going to continue to try at least one more time and get a really good test bed for this and see. Because the bottom line is, while some people complain and get annoyed that I talk about what microphone I use on the podcasts, many more people than that listen with headphones on or through a stereo. And if there's a lot of background noise, it can get annoying, can give you a headache and all that stuff. And those are really the people I care about. So, not so much the people that get annoyed when I talk for 10 seconds about microphones. No offense. So I really do want to keep going and get this as good as possible. So last week the fail was I wasn't close enough, which I think now it probably picks up my voice better and probably less background noise because I don't need to spike the volume. Today's fail was there was no comparison because obviously the laptop's built-in audio interface isn't good enough for recording real voiceovers. So I guess we'll see next week for the regular podcast. I'll do the same side by side like I did this time, and hopefully it works and hopefully it's worth it. But anyway, as always, thanks so much to everybody. Thanks to the people that just listen and support. I mean, that's awesome by itself, and it's super appreciated. But also the people the nerds like me that like to jump in and figure out why and what and all that stuff. I always appreciate your feedback so much. And, even if I don't take every suggestion, it's always put in my brain, and I use that when I start to think about other stuff, and I always take everybody's opinion seriously. So thank you so much. And as always, I'll see you next week.